box has a brand new pack of cards. Let's see what's inside.
Hey guys, it's another pack opening, and this time we've got the Kingsmoot pack. You know, Kingsmoot is a card, but I think we're going to care a little bit more about this lady on the front here. That's probably the reason why I ordered it. Let's get started. Starting off the Starks, we have Ramsay Snow. Now, he is an awkward 5 cost, and he has one of those abilities that only activates when he's marshaled, which is a little annoying, but it's basically similar to the plot card March to the Wall in that as soon as you play him, both players sacrifice another character, or, you know, you can always sacrifice him, which is kind of the problem with this compared to March to the Wall, in that there are situations where you don't have any characters, like after certain setups, where you can use March to the Wall and your opponent will only get hit, but this guy can always sacrifice himself. That being said, it's great that this is when he enters play and not just when he's marshaled. There's some tricky stuff you can do with this, especially out of faction, but I'll get to that in a second. There are pros and cons to sacrificing versus killing. Killing is obviously better because your opponent then can't use any more copies of key unique characters, if that's what they chose, unless they're willing to dedicate a plot card to it. But sacrificing is honestly harder to avoid. It gets past protection like Long May He Reign, and it also allows you to potentially steal those characters from your opponent if you're running this with like a Night's Watch deck. In general, the Boltons are kind of interesting. They do here fill a little niche in the Starks, which is sacrificing characters. Cards like Catelyn Stark and I think like Jon Snow have effects that trigger when cards are sacrificed. Starks like to do that more than anyone, so this is good for them, and a lot of the Bolton cards do that in general. But the Boltons are also very easy to run in half Stark decks because they have a lot of out-of-faction support. They have indirect out-of-faction support by sacrificing things that the Night's Watch can then steal with the Wall or the Old Bear. That's one faction they can use it with. But there's also even a Lannister version of a Harrenhal that specifies a Lannister card or a House Bolton card from your hand. So they are definitely meant to combo, and in fact, what you can do with them that's kind of cool, since they all have to do with sacrificing, is you can run them in a combo deck, but still use a lot of those Stark cards that only trigger when you only control Stark characters by sacrificing non-Starks. That would be a little bit tricky to do, but there's a lot of versatility with the Bolton engine, and Ramsay Snow is a pretty good card. He's less of a character and, you know, more of an effect, but there are ways to put him into play. He's just very good at what he does. The next Dark card is the Dreadfort. How appropriate. It is a House Bolton card, even though it's not a character, but it's also the North location, which means that the new version of Rickard Karstark can use it to his advantage. And basically, after a card you control a sacrifice, you kneel the Dreadfort to choose instead a House Bolton or non-Stark characters. So this is what I was saying about how Bolton's liking to run combo decks. They like to run with other things that aren't just Starks. House Bolton cards are Starks, so you can use it on them, or you can use it on anything that's not a Stark. This is also non-loyal, as is Ramsay, and as are most, if not all, of the Boltons. So you probably wouldn't want to make a loyal half-Stark deck with the Boltons. You'd want it to be non-loyal, but this is an effective location for meeting that board state that you're trying to get to if you play a Bolton deck. Use this with the Lannister version of Harrenhal, or do something snazzier with it, maybe Night's Watch or something else. But yeah, the Bolton card pool isn't enormous, but they do have a very well-defined synergy. Let's do Dorne next, because why not? We have Darkstar. Now, this version of Darkstar is the second one, same cost, although it doesn't have the Intimidate that the other one has, which is really good, but both are still House Dame, which means they can benefit heavily from Dawn, and in fact, Dawn can give House Dane characters Intimidate, which doesn't do anything to the other version of Darkstar, but it does help this one, and having Intimidate and Stealth on the same character is great. So this is one of the best Dawn targets in the game. And then, after he bypasses a character using Stealth, which doesn't matter if you win the challenge or not. It basically just means you pick that character as long as they don't have stealth or they don't have a weird situation where they can't be bypassed by stealth, and they lose a challenge icon. And there's a lot of support for characters losing challenge icons or characters that have very few challenge icons being killed. And along the way, they're losing challenge icons, so your opponent has fewer attacker and defenders. This is a solid card, really solid House Dane card. Unfortunately, the Knight trait isn't as supported in Dorne as it is in other factions, but it's still just a really good one-off, and I would say the better version of the two Darkstars, just because if I'm going to run Darkstar, I'm going to run Dawn, and I don't want to get that redundant Intimidate. That's so annoying. The next Dorne card is a little bit weird. It's a 1-cost non-unique attachment called Sandsteed. You can only put 1 on a character, which I've never seen the restriction of before, but whatever. I guess you need to have multiple characters if you want multiple Sandsteeds. I mean, it makes sense. It's a horse, but there are other Warhorse cards that I have not seen affected by this. After a summer card enters use pile, attached character gains 1 power. So if you're running a dedicated summer deck, perhaps with the agenda Kings of Summer, then this basically gives you a power every turn, which is pretty helpful, especially for something that's non-terminal and non-unique. I would say it's this and like 1 or 2 other cards that make Dorn probably the second best summer faction after Tyrell, but honestly, it's not usually worth that much dedicating your plot deck, which is precious and which is small, to one specific archetype for some hopeful main deck support. Some of the plot deck archetypes like Winter Reserves and of course the city cards have self-support, but Summer doesn't as much. Within the plot deck, they're just kind of good cards. So if you notice yourself running trade routes for your econ, time of plenty for your drawing, stuff like that, then you could toss one of these in. It's definitely not bad. If you did make a dedicated summer deck, this would be very valuable. And you could also make a Dornish attachment deck. Dorn has some pretty solid attachments, and attachment decks with them are pretty unique and fun. So this is a pretty cool card, I guess. I've never run it because it locks you into a certain type of plot card, but it's probably the best type of plot card when you don't consider the support around it, except for, I don't know, maybe Scheme. All right, next up, we have Sir Hyle Hunt for the Tyrells. Now, he is a 4-cost knight, which is pretty solid. It's commonplace to see that trade in Tyrells, and it's commonplace to see support for it. And you have this weird thing that's kind of similar to the effect of Highgarden, where when he's participating in a challenge, you can pay a gold to stand a character and remove it from the challenge if they have lower strength than Hyle Hunt does. So at base, that's 3, which means you can only get rid of characters that have 2 or 1 because it's strictly lower, not less than or equal to. But there's a lot of cards that they can have that will increase the attack of their characters during a challenge. There's even an econ card that does it, which is really weird but really cool. If you don't have Brienne of Tarth or something else out, Hyle Hunt is also a valid target for cards that give him strength, in the sense that he gets additional abilities beyond just the strength of more options for who he can remove from the challenge. So honestly, pretty solid card. It is really telegraphed though, and it does cost you an extra gold per turn, and if you don't buff him, this isn't going to be that helpful, although you can use it to stop your opponent from blocking unopposed challenges with their like 1-cost marshalling cheapeners or whatever. The next Tyrell card is hilarious. It is, to my knowledge, the only limited event in the game. There's a couple limited characters and Lannisters, but for the most part, limited applies to locations. And dang, is this thing insane. So you pay 2, then you gain 5 gold. It can't be canceled. So this is basically, you get an additional 3 gold this turn, and it doesn't stay out like characters or locations do, so it's just a big bounty of gold, if you will. This card is hilarious. It's a little less consistent than other limited cards in that it's worthless in setup, and having a good ratio of limited cards to your setup hand is a really important part of deck building in this game. But running 1 copy or something, just playing an event in the middle of the challenges phase when you only seem to have 2 gold, but all of a sudden you have 5 now, and you can do a bunch more stuff, is a good mix-up to your opponent. Although if they're meta savvy, they'll know this card because it kind of stands out as the only limited event in the game. You can obviously, of course, play it again if you're running Annals of Castle Black, but again, that would still count as your limited card for the turn. So overall, I think this card is pretty funny, and I think it's really cool that it exists. I would personally rather rely on locations, but if you're playing a deck that likes events, not necessarily a Dark Wings, Dark Words agenda, but maybe like a Queen of Thorns type deck that uses some of the Tyrell event support, maybe Loras Tyrell, then you can definitely run this. There are situations where it is better than certain locations to have at least 1 or 2 copies of this in it, and this is just such a sassy card. Now we'll move on to the Targaryens. We start with the 2-cost companion and Dothraki character Jequi. So she is unique and Dothraki, but doesn't have a military icon, which is kind of uncommon for Dothrakis, and companion means she's searching searchable by Streets of Silk. It has an interesting ability where when you win a challenge, she doesn't have to be participating, and it's not once per turn. You can discard a card from your hand to have a Lord or Lady character that was participating gain 1 power. This is really meant to be used with Daenerys because while Lord and Lady is a very common trait, there aren't that many in Targaryen other than Daenerys, and so many Targaryen decks run Daenerys, although the Dothraki ones are pretty independent from her. So you could use Jiqui with non-loyal aces you're running in combo decks, and there's probably a few other targets in Targaryens, like Viserys, for instance, but none that are probably as good as Daenerys. But this is actually really good. Discarding a card from your hand, as we've seen and talked about a million times before, is not always a huge cause for Targaryens because they have cards like Missandei, for instance, who like to be discarded and retain your advantage. However, if you really want to do this 3 times, and a big strength of hers is that you could, maybe even 6 times if you really had some tricks up your sleeve, you're just losing those cards and you're going to go down hard, especially if your opponent gets an intrigue on you. You're going to be going against the draw curve of the game and having a net negative of cards overall, let alone in your hand. So this is a really cool way to turn hand advantage into power, especially for a character like Daenerys who you're going to be protecting, but you really need to have the draw power to go along with it, or just you can toss in 1 copy and, you know, use it to sort of push for wins towards the end. I think this is a pretty helpful card, but it doesn't have the best traits for what it does. Next up for Targaryens is a card I really like. It's called the Skahazden. Now, it's non-limited, but it is an econ card, which I love. What it does is give you 2 gold after plot cards are revealed if you discard a card from your hand, or if it was a summer plot card, 3 gold. Now, this is what I mean when I talk about how it's really helpful that the summer plot cards are not only supported by the main deck, but there's also a lot of splashable ones. You can run this card. It's a very solid non-limited econ card that works in setup or beyond, that will give you 2 gold consistently every turn if you want to trade in a card from your hand for that. But if you're playing something like Trade Routes or Time of Plenty, or in a night deck, something like Tourney for the King, then you can just have 3 or 4 situations of turns where you'll get 3 gold from this. If you're playing a dedicated summer deck, you can go for that. This is a loyal card, and there's not that much summer support in Targaryens. So I really think you should just use this and then use some staple summer cards. If you're not using any staple summer cards, then this still has value if you're using a heavy discard engine in your deck. But the thing is that if you are looking at this and thinking that's 2 extra gold every turn, you're forgetting that it's 2 extra gold every turn basically at the cost of, instead of gaining 2 cards per turn, gaining 1. That doesn't seem like a big trade-off in the immediacy, especially if you're discarding cards that you'd actually like to discard, like Friedman or, of course, Missandei. But in the long term, that really can have an impact if you have too much gold and too few cards, or too many cards and not enough gold. Either way, that the balance is imbalanced messes you up in this game. So you definitely want to make sure that you use this card intelligently, but hey, more random summer support is fun. Starting the Night's Watch, we have Haunted Forest Scout. Now, this card is a little bit tricky to use, but I think it's kind of slept on. So it can't be declared as a defender, which is really antithetical to a lot of the Night's Watch strategies. But if you control 3 or more ranger characters, and he himself is a ranger, then he doesn't kneel when declared as an attacker. Now, you could just play 3 of these and none of them would kneel, and that is really helpful, but he can't be declared as a defender no matter what. And so this has to go in an aggressive Night's Watch deck, which the Rangers are the most aggressive of the types of Night's Watch cards, but there are not that many of them. You can bring this guy out pretty easily if you're running Old Forest Hunter or Forest Patrol, which are 2 of the best Rangers. And then there's even other Rangers that will buff these guys for even being Rangers, like Jeremy Wrecker. If you use Jeremy Wrecker and this guy has all 3 icons, then you, without kneeling anything, have guaranteed access to all 3 challenges on the offense. I'm more used to defensive Night's Watch decks, but I could definitely see how this guy is good for 2 cost, a body on the board, at worst something you kill for military that's not even unique, and would run well with a bunch of other Rangers. Or if you'd like to tech in some other stuff, you can use Sworn to the Watch to make anything with a military icon a Ranger. That can be helpful because there's just a good amount of support that benefits from having multiple rangers, like that event that kneels to rangers when your opponent declares a challenge to kill one of their things. You'd like to have more rangers. They can also get strength from Fist of the First Men. So this guy is just kind of a more binary version of that, where if you don't have enough rangers, he's kind of useless, and if you do, he's pretty good, especially for his cost. So depending on when you get him or how quickly you can trigger him, he could go one of either ways. But if your deck is built right, this guy is actually a really solid little piece of it. The next Night's Watch card has gotten a lot better given recent Bestow support. It's Molestown. But I gotta say, when they came out with it, it's like, what? Bestow 4, that's super expensive, although it is a one-cost location, so it can be put into play by Aged Craftsman, which is pretty sassy. It can also be stood by Westwatch by the Bridge, even if you don't have one each of a Ranger Builder or Steward, and I'm pretty sure like Shadow Tower is one of the only other valid targets for that, so that's kind of interesting. But that only even is relevant because this card has the audacity to not only require you to kneel it, but also pay a gold that you bestowed onto it. And so what you're doing is giving a character your opponent controls, one that doesn't have gold, mind you, which is not that trivial anymore considering how easy it is for a lot of decks to put gold on things, onto one of their characters, and then that character can't be declared as an attacker till the end of the phase. So that's kind of helpful if you're trying to win unopposed challenges or just win on the defense. But the thing is that it being telegraphed means that if you go first, your opponent knows you can do this, so they're going to use what they suspect you're going to use Molestown on to block instead of attack. Now that'll whittle down their options, yada yada yada, but at the end of the day, I think there are better ways for the Night's Watch to do this. It just does synergize with Aged Craftsman and Westwatch by the Bridge, like I mentioned, which means in certain decks, I could see why it would be one of the locations you decide to run of the many that are available. There's such a wide breadth of Night's Watch locations that sometimes you're going to run even something like this. But they did go out on a limb trying to make a Night's Watch Bestow card, and not the biggest fan. Now moving on to the stars of the pack, the Greyjoys, we will start with Asha Greyjoy, 7-cost Trigon version. There are 2 other versions, and I think it's worth bringing them up really quick because, of course, they're relevant in a discussion of this one. The original 2 Ashas are both non-loyal, which is a huge factor that differentiates them from this one, and in general, I would say if you're running a loyal Greyjoy deck, you're always going to use this version of Asha, but there's one of the 2 non-loyal versions that I might make an exception for. The worst of the 2, in my opinion, is the 6-cost one, which is tied with Victarion for being the most expensive card in the non-loyal Greyjoy pool. It has stealth and I think pillage, and then it has this ability that gives stealth to every other unique Ironborn character you control, which is actually pretty annoying. The Ironborn trait is rarer than it should be, and getting unique cards out like that, there's one, Carl the Maid, which also supports Asha, but in general, you have to build your deck so much around that one, and it gets you a bunch of stealth, which is great, but ultimately, I would really not run that unless you were running a hyper-specific deck. The original version of Asha, the 5-cost non-loyal one, is actually pretty good. She has stealth, and then after she wins an unopposed challenge, she stands herself. That card is not as good as this card. I mean, this one already has stealth, even though it has a little less support for it. I could see you running maybe a really stealth-focused deck that used that version instead. Maybe. It's cheaper, and standing itself is nice, but this card is so good. Let's talk about it. It's the only version of Asha to have all the icons. It has pillage, and it has stealth. Stealth is just a really good keyword to have in general, and it's also supported by the Ironborn. Pillage is a terrible keyword to have in general, but it's really supported by the Greyjoys, especially this thing. She's a captain, which gets some support from some cards, like every captain is a king. She's an Ironborn, so she can be resurrected with Aeron Damphair, and she is a lady, which means you can cheat her out with Heir to the Iron Throne, although this faction has fewer low-cost lords and ladies to use as fodder for that than a lot of other factions do. One option you have is Newly Made Lord. He's a pretty good choice for it. But regardless, pillage and stealth in this faction, both great. keywords to have, and if she has her warship out, she gets Renown. Renown is great, and obviously it would be good if she had it already, but it's great that she has the ability to with a card that synergizes really well with her and is just really good. And she has this ability that is kind of insane. When she discards a card using Pillage, then you can search the top X cards of your deck, where X is the amount of cards in your opponent's discard pile, and add one card to your hand. Now, this card is a little bit iffy at the very end game because you will have an insane amount of cards to search, so it's good at the near end game for sure, but like, are you going to get a chance to use it? Maybe. If you can survive for one more turn, yes, but it's probably not going to push you right to victory. It's going to get you some clinch card, and it's designed to search and help you build your strategy as opposed to being a win condition on its own. It really thrives in the mid game where you're basically just doing a top, between 5 and 10 cards of your deck search every turn. But even if your opponent has none and you play this first thing, there's nothing in their discard pile. After she pillages, there will be one which is effectively a draw 1. So when your worst case scenario for your ability is an insight on top of the stealth and pillage you have already, that is not bad. If she ends up with Renown, Stealth, and Pillage, and then her ability is just effectively a extremely better version of Insight that self-combos and makes relevant a lot of other pillage cards, then you're doing something right. You're probably not going to just use her to win, but she is one of the biggest cards when it comes to stitching together a strategy. Pillage as a keyword is so bad. You need to have specific cards that synergize with it. This one does it best, and it self combos, and then it lets you search the other ones so that you can get a board state that's actually going to win. An amazing card right here. I think probably the reason I got this pack. Really, really solid ace. And now that we've seen the face of this pack, we are ready to see the name. This is a 2-cost event called Kingsmoot. After you win dominance, which Ironborn, especially Drowned Gods, have a lot of support for, you choose a unique, I don't want to say Ironborn, a unique Greyjoy character you control, and then it gains a power for every unique Greyjoy character you control. So this would actually go pretty well with a 6-cost version of Asha, which kind of makes sense because her artwork in that, I think, is her like cheering at the Kingsmoot or whatever. This is okay. There is support for winning dominance. This is better than it would be in a lot of other factions. Aeron Damphair can resurrect Ironborn characters, and certain attachments can only be given to Ironborn characters, like the ever dangerous throwing axe. So this is a pretty solid way to chunk a bunch of power onto something. I mean, it's not that hard to get like 3. If you do it on the right turn, you can get a lot more than that. And it's not that hard to win dominance, especially if you're using Priest of Old Wick. Priest of Old Wick is good, or some locations that'll help you. So honestly, I could see you running it. I end up cutting it. I really don't like dominance actions, and I really don't like events that cost 2, and so I really don't like 2-cost dominance events. They're just not my favorite. I wouldn't want to save up all this gold. I would be wanting to get a bunch of power, and then if you keep this in your hand for too long, then you run the risk of either a board wipe or it just being intrigued. So it's kind of tricky to figure out when to play this and to integrate this 2 gold into your hand. It's a little awkward to play around, although it could be devastating on the level of uneroded Durand's game if you use it right. Now let's do Lannisters. We have Wrath the Sweetling. He is a pillage card, and he is one of the small amount of characters that support this little pocket of pillage support that exists in the Lannister faction. There's a bunch of Ironborn cards. It's pretty much locked into that faction, but Lannisters have a tiny, tiny little pillage support pocket, and Tywin, what version of him, is actually one of the aces. This is just Wrath. He's a 5-cost, and he's non-loyal, so you could even run him in a Ironborn deck. And he, like a lot of the Lannister cards, has an ability that activates when he pillages specific cards. So if he discards a character, which is the most likely one to get, I would say, you can choose a character with printing cost 2 or lower and return it to your opponent's hand. Or its owner's hand, I should say. I can't really think of a situation where you would use that on yourself, but yeah, I guess you could get rid of like a Tears of Lys on your Iron Islands Fishmonger, but I'm sure that there is a savage way to do that. In general, though, if you use it to get rid of one of your opponent's 1-cost econ characters, then they're just going to play it next turn and tap it to pay for itself, so it's not really a huge deal. But he does have military, which is pretty good for Lannisters, although his only trait is ally, which just means he's searchable by Streets of Silk, and that's, who is even running Streets of Silk? It's terrible. I hate that I have to mention it every time I see an ally or companion. I have to edit that onto the screen. But anyway, yeah, I don't think this card is that good. I don't think the Lannister Pillage engine is that good, but I guess if you were running the Lannister Pillage engine, because I'm pretty sure the version of Tywin that uses Pillage is loyal, so you can't make it a mostly Ironborn deck, you probably run this card, I guess. Next Lannister card is Sparring in Secret. It's a 1-cost event. You kneel a knight, you stand another knight. Now, I don't know if this means you can kneel your opponent's knight. There are some cards that say kneel where it's implied that you want to kneel your own character, but it's unclear if you have the ability to kneel your opponent's. So I'm going to assume you have to kneel your own, which makes me think a lot of the Tyrell 0-cost event, Bonds of Chivalry, which is a little more complicated than this card, but probably just a better version, and Tyrells have better knights and better knight support in general, but this is sassy. You can kneel knights in order to save kings with the white cloak, and then stand them again and kneel another knight. Anytime that you can do like a swap like that, like it's obviously better to just stand things in general, but even doing a swap where you trade one thing being knelt for something else, like with Bonds of Chivalry, is good because it really keeps your opponent guessing, and their calculations might end up being way off, and you can do this at the very last second, and it's only 1 cost, so pretty good event if you're doing a Lannister Knight deck. You can do that considering that they have so many Kingsguard. You could maybe even use the White Book Agenda, and if you do, I would definitely recommend you running this card, but I think it would also work best since it's a non-loyal event in a half Lannister, half Tyrell deck, because then you'd be able to use all the Tyrell events and use this on all the Tyrell Knights, which would be awesome, and you would have some of the Lannister Kingsguard as backup support. Okay, on to our next faction, which is also our last faction. It's the Baratheons. We're starting off with Lyseni Pirate. Now, this is a raider, which has some support in the Ironborns, but it's also a smuggler, which has very small amount of support and very few amount of characters that have this trait within mostly, probably entirely Baratheon, specifically in the form of Salador San. He also supports worship locations, which might ring a bit Greyjoy to you. There's actually a lot of synergy between the Baratheons and Greyjoys because both of them, A, have warship support, although Greyjoys have way more warships and way more support, and B, both of them like to win dominance. So it's actually a pretty easy combo deck to make. What's unfortunate is that the smuggler trait is not like captain or whatever, so nothing in Ironborn supports it, and you barely even see it, although there is a new card, King's Landing Smuggler. But what does this guy do? Well, he can have stealth if you have a warship. There's a ton of splashable warships. There's a few in Baratheon. There's a ton in Greyjoy, and there's like 1 or 2 per most factions. Then there's splashable neutral ones like Jade Sea Drummond is pretty solid. I think the best choice for warship in Baratheons is, I forget what it's called, maybe like Lyseni Galley, but it's a 1-cost non-unique warship. So if you're running Baratheons and you want this guy's effect to be triggered, you can spam your deck with those without worrying much, and they're actually pretty solid. Then he'll gain stealth. That's cool. Stealth is great. Stealth with these icons and that stats, not bad at all. Then when you win a challenge when he's attacking, you take 1 gold from an opponent's gold pool or from a card they control and add it to your gold pool. That's a weird way that this synergizes with the new card King's Landing Smuggler, because when that leaves play, I guess you could put it gold on your opponent's card and then take it with this, which is actually pretty savage. Good card design by the Conclave there. But in general, this flexibility is pretty great. I mean, cards that rely on your opponent having gold in their pool, it's not uncommon, but I mean, not only do you have to rely on that happening without much ability to do anything about it, except I guess King's Landing Smuggler, but you also need to be able to spend it yourself, and this is just 1 gold at a time. However, you know, it contributes to dominance gaps, and in particular, if you take it off one of their cards, you're just straight up weakening their board for the most part with the new Free Companies agenda, but always with cards like Saltcliffe Sailor and Cersei's Informer. This is really helpful, and there's not a lot of cards that can do this that anti-bestow like this. Overall, card that's part of a very niche strategy, but definitely a cool one. And the next Baratheon card is, of course, a warship. It is Laughing Lord. It's unique and it's 2 costs. After you initiate a challenge, you can kneel this to choose an attacking Baratheon character and give it Intimidate for that one challenge. Intimidate is just good in general, but it's especially good if you're running any kneel control in your deck, because kneeling things is great if they can't stand at the end of the turn, and it's also great if you're going first, because then your opponent can't attack with them. Also, you'll note that it combos with the card we just looked at, Lyseni Pirate, because Lyseni Pirate will gain stealth if there's a warship out, and then this will also give Intimidate, and as I said earlier in this video, stealth and Intimidate is one of the best combos of keywords that you could possibly have. So this is pretty decent, but again, it's probably not just worth running unless you're doing some other smuggler, warship, captain type of support in your Baratheon deck, and that's a pretty small pool of cards, but it's pretty easy to team up with Greyjoy if you want to. All of these are non-loyals. Now on to the neutral cards. We're starting off with Tom of Seven Streams. So he's a Brotherhood card, he's a minstrel card, which has no support but is pretty prolific, and he's a roller, which is relevant. For 4 costs, being a monogon with 3 strength isn't very good, and he has a very specific ability, which is after you play a song event, which admittedly is probably the most common trait for events, but is spread out a lot between factions. You can choose instead a non-loyal character you control. All the Brotherhood cards have support for non-loyals, which is not bad because a lot of cards are non-loyals and all neutral cards are, but not everything is a song. If you want to run a song deck, well, you'll be using this guy because he's neutral, but then you can use Darion from the Night's Watch, although the Night's Watch doesn't have a lot of great songs other than the Rat Cook, which requires a lot of setup, or more likely you'll be using Highgarden Minstrel, I believe, which is a non-unique Tyrell card that can give you a gold every time a song is played. So, I mean, there is some support for songs. There's even, I think, a new Baratheon card that has some support for it, but for 4 costs, already specifying non-loyals, you would have to be using a deck that relied a lot on Hollow Hill and decide that you're not only going to play a bunch of events, but they're going to be songs. And there's no way that you're not making a few concessions there. One really good way to build a song deck that I noticed is if you do Tyrell, which you probably should. I mean, I'm not sure you should be building a song deck, but if you want to, hey, we've all been there. You put in this guy, you put in 3 copies of Highgarden Minstrel, and then a song that's really helpful is Bear in the Maiden Fair, because it costs 0 gold, so it can generate you a gold off of Highgarden Minstrel, and you can play it at any time because it's an action. So it can trigger things like this or Highgarden Minstrel whenever you want, which is really helpful. The Tyrells have a couple of other songs. Lord Renly's Ride isn't bad, but you're going to have to mostly be looking at the neutral pool. And in general, most of the Brotherhood cards are pretty splashable into any deck who has decided that running loyal cards isn't worth giving up the potential searchability from Hollow Hill. This guy is not splashable at all, but if you make a deck that uses him, it's hilarious. Next up is an example of a much more splashable Brotherhood card. It's Lemoncloak, and even he pales in comparison to Anguy the Archer. But for a 3 cost, normally his stats, trash, right? 1 icon and then 2 strength. But if you have no loyal characters, then all of a sudden he's 2 icons, 4 strength. For instance, if you're running the agenda, the Brotherhood without banners, then you can't run any loyal characters, and all of these restrictions just disappear. Not that they aren't restrictions, but they're restrictions you already committed to when building your deck for your agenda. So all of a sudden you can look at this guy and be like, this is a flat 3 cost with higher strength than his cost and 2 icons. That's pretty good. He's also a roller card like a lot of the Brotherhood cards, so since they are all neutral and you do need to pick a faction to play them with, a really easy, simple choice is Baratheons, because they are the only place that has roller support, and the Brotherhood trait and the roller trait pretty much go hand in hand, at least in the neutral piles. So yeah, Lemoncloak is just a good example of what I was saying, of just a very splashable, generic card that supports non-loyals, and considering that all the Brotherhood cards are neutrals, none of them will be loyal, so just don't use the best cards in your card pool, the loyal ones, and you do get a lot of benefits for it, even if you're not using the agenda. The final neutral card is an event that is aptly named because, dang, I forgot this thing totally existed, but it's actually kind of powerful. It's a 3-cost dominance event, which obviously rubs me the wrong way right away, and it's also a faction kneeler. So this thing's pretty audacious, but what it has the ability to do is get rid of anything that has a lower printed cost, I believe, than the amount of faction on your opponent's faction card. Now, it's possible your opponent has win conditions that include gaining a lot of power at once with things like Tourney for the King or Duran's Game, or they're going to keep their power on their characters instead of on their faction cards. But what this can do is save you from almost any card if played in the late game of a traditional way where someone wins by getting around 15 power on their faction card, maybe like 12, and then having a few characters. This can probably have one turn where if you're willing to save 3 gold, which is probably not going to be safe if your opponent has that much power and you're probably going to be losing, you can get rid of one of their characters. I think it's really inconsistent. It's not good until end game, and by end game I mean in the sense of like you're probably about to lose, or at the very least you're about to lose if you don't do something. Maybe that thing will be this, but even if you get rid of a bunch of power from a character they have, well, they still have a lot of power because you got to play this in the first place. You can't possibly bring them down to like 0 power because your ability to get rid of things is based on what they have on their faction card. So this is a pretty good card, I guess. Honestly, no, this is a bad card, and I'll tell you why. It's a neutral card, so it's splashable, but it's competing with everything else that's splashable. It's a dominance action, which is the worst type. It's a faction kneeler, which restricts you from a lot of things. It's 3 costs, which is way too much to save for a whole turn. It only works when you're losing by too much for it to be effective. It doesn't kill the character, so it probably just sets your opponent back a little bit. It requires you to be in a situation where you're losing and then doesn't do anything about that. Like, it doesn't do anything to your opponent's faction card. There's a reason this card was forgotten by history, but it is a sleeper removal option if you feel like teching it in. And lastly, we have a very good plot card, the Withering Cold. Now, this card has surprisingly good stats for a winter plot card. Now, winter plot cards are super supported, but a lot of times if you want to do a winter deck, you'll get a lot of claim probably, but you won't have a lot of gold. This card has a comfortable 5 gold and a very comfortable 6 initiative. Of course, 1 claim, but that's fine. This card serves its purpose. It is plot deck limit 1, and that's probably for the best because it skips the standing phase of this round, which is one of the biggest stall cards in this game. I mean, I would consider cards like this and a Game of Thrones to be 2 of the biggest plot deck stall cards. I mean, I guess there's Calm Over Westeros or whatever, but ways to basically make your opponent do almost nothing. With the Withering Cold, it also has the capacity to stall for kind of 2 turns, so this really will slow things down, and it will affect you as well, which includes not just characters, but also locations. So you do have to play very cleverly about, oh, am I going to tap my sea tower or whatever econ locations I have now or save them for next turn, which is a little bit difficult to do, but it can be buffed with winter reserves, and it is a card that synergizes with a lot of main deck cards, like a lot of Stark cards, a good amount of Ironborn cards, a couple of Night's Watch cards, and then some neutral wildlings like Mance Raider. So this is one of my favorite winter plot cards. I love the stats, I love the ability, really forces your opponent to think long term, but it can be hard for you too as well. So try and build your deck around, in my opinion, if you're going to be running this, more things like Rose Road that are passive +1s that don't kneel themselves, rather than things like Sea Towers or Blood Orange Groves that kneel themselves in order to give you their econ. Because if you're going to be running something like this, or something like King in the North even, you don't want things to kneel, or in that case, you wouldn't want things to trigger. So really good stall card, and happens to be supported very much by its trait, but as with all stall cards, you have to be careful that you don't stall yourself more than you stall your opponent. All right, another pack opening complete. It's good to be back. Hopefully this one will be a little shorter than the rest, but we'll find out when I'm editing, and the longer I talk, the longer it'll